Hello and welcome to BYJU'S classes. In this lecture, we shall deconstruct the recent landmark visit of the Indian Prime Minister to the State of Israel. In fact, this was the first state visit by an Indian Prime Minister in the last 70 years. Clearly, this is a historic development and it will redefine India's relationship with an important strategic partner. It also marks a significant departure from the zero-sum approach of India's diplomatic engagement with Israel. So before we discuss the recent developments, let's get a brief historical context on India's ties with Israel. The State of Israel, which achieved independence in 1948, it received formal official recognition by India only in 1950. And it took us 42 years to establish a full-fledged diplomatic relationship, which was done only in the year 1992. And this was despite having close security and defense ties via covert back channels since the 1960s itself. This reluctance on India's part in publicly acknowledging its ties with Israel was primarily driven by both internal and as well as external considerations. Much like India and Pakistan, both Israel and as well as Palestine were born under tumultuous circumstances, which were largely created by the partition process which both the regions have undergone. The partition plan of Israel proposed a two-state solution. In fact, the Zionist national movement, which was fighting for a Jewish homeland in the Middle Eastern region, this was perceived as a threat to Arab nationalism. Consequently, the Palestinian outfits, which were opposed to the creation of Israel, they received immense support from the Arab states so that they could prevent the establishment of a Jewish state in the midst of the Arab world. So this evolving situation in 1948 tested India's fledgling foreign policy establishment. Now, with this in mind, let's have a look at the factors which influenced India's Israel policy prior to 1992. Like I said, there were both external factors and as well as internal factors. So if we look at the external factors, primarily it was India's approach with regard to the non-aligned movement and with regard to its anti-imperialism stance, which drove India's policy towards Israel. And second, India was seen to be more pro towards the Arab countries. So these were the two external factors which determined India's diplomatic stand on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In fact, post-independence, India was steadfast in spearheading the cause of anti-imperialism and the non-aligned principle as well. Due to this principled approach, India had to side with the Arab states with regard to this conflict. In fact, India was the first non-Arab country to recognize the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was officially recognized by India, and India became the first non-Arab country to recognize the PLO. Even though India was in favor of securing the rights of both the Jews and as well as the Palestinians, it was not comfortable in supporting the creation of a state based on religious lines. Because India having undergone the horrors of such a partition in 1947, we clearly knew the consequences of establishing countries based on religious lines. So with regard to this, India was not supporting the partition plan of Israel and Palestine. Initially, it did not support the two-state solution. It joined the Arab and as well as the Islamic countries in opposing the partition of Palestine into two different regions or two different countries. On the other hand, India proposed a federal state with an autonomous structure wherein both communities, that is the Palestinian Muslims and as well as the Jews of Israel, could be given an autonomous area under the Palestinian administration. A federal structure was proposed by India at the United Nations. So with regard to this, India even opposed Israel's membership of the UN, pointing out that it could not recognize an Israel which had been achieved through the use of force and not through negotiations. Because when the state of Israel was established, there was excessive use of force from the Israeli side, which had come in for international condemnation. And India supported the Arab states in opposing the creation of a Jewish state in Middle East. India's pro-Arab stance was also driven by strategic calculations. India considered the Arab states to be strategically important due to three reasons. Primarily, there were three reasons which India considered from the Middle Eastern perspective. The Arab countries were important with regard to Pakistan. India's equation with the Arab states was important in exercising influence over Pakistan. And the ability of Arab states to influence Pakistan played a critical role in Indian foreign policy being more aligned towards the Arab countries. And second, with regard to India's energy security, India was primarily dependent on oil supplies which were coming in from the Middle East. And since India was extremely reliant on the Middle Eastern supply of oil, it was very crucial for India to be in good terms with the Middle Eastern countries. So India did not want to antagonize the Arab countries by supporting Israel during the crisis situation. And third, the huge presence of the Indian diaspora. According to estimates, there are around 6 to 7 million Indians who reside in the Gulf who are working, and the remittances they send back play a very important role in balancing the fiscal deficit of India. So the huge presence of Indian diaspora in the Gulf countries and the concerns over their well-being played a very important role in India adopting a pro-Arab stance. So these three reasons drove India's foreign policy approach with regard to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Now let's talk about the internal factors which have driven India's Israel policy prior to 1992. Because India's relationship with Israel can be divided into two phases. One between 1950 to 1992. The second phase post 1992. So we need to talk about the nature of ties between India and Israel in both the phases. So if you have to understand India's approach towards Israel prior to 1992, we need to talk about the internal factors or the domestic factors in India which was having an influence on Indian foreign policy. We just spoke about the external factors, wherein India had adopted an anti-imperialistic approach, and India was pioneering the non-aligned movement during the Cold War days. So naturally, India could not support imperialistic enforcement of a Jewish state in the Middle Eastern region, which was primarily supported by the British government and the United States government. And second, India could not support the creation of Israel, which was accused of using excessive force instead of resorting to negotiations. These two external factors played a very important role in India supporting the Arab countries. And the third reason was India considered the Arab states to be strategically important, primarily due to three reasons. One, their ability to influence Pakistani politics. Second, with regard to India's reliance on oil supplies that come in from the Middle East. And third, with regard to the huge Indian diaspora present in the Gulf region. So India was concerned about their well-being as well as the remittances which they sent back, which is extremely important in bridging the fiscal deficit of India. While these were the external factors which was having an influence on India's Israel policy, now let's evaluate the internal factors which drove India's Israel policy prior to 1992. Most Indian governments and the political parties in India were skeptical in extending support to Israel. And this was primarily due to electoral calculations. They didn't want to antagonize the Indian Muslim population by openly favoring Israel over Palestine. A combination of these internal and external pressures led India to keep Israel at an arm's length until 1992. At least this was true as far as our overt diplomatic ties were concerned. But due to our pressing geopolitical and strategic needs, India had already initiated a covert channel to develop ties with the state of Israel back in the 1960s itself. Since 1960s, India and Israel have shared mutual concerns with regard to Pakistan, especially Pakistan's nuclear program. So prior to 1992, India and Israel had already established covert back-channel ties between both the governments. This was primarily done keeping in mind Pakistan's nuclear program and its role in sponsoring terrorism in the region. So these two factors brought India and Israel together, and covert ties were initiated back in the 1960s itself. So due to the limitations on the Indian government, which we just discussed, that is both internal and external constraints, it was not possible for India to develop official ties in the public domain. Hence, India and Israel resorted to a covert back channel led by their respective intelligence agencies. The Research and Analysis Wing of India and the Mossad of Israel were authorized by their respective governments in the 1960s to initiate the development of a covert back channel so that they could mutually work together in the defense and security sphere. Because in the 1960s, both India and Israel perceived a common threat in the region. And this was primarily revolving around Pakistan's activity in South Asia and as well as in the Middle East. Also, India expressed interest in procuring the advanced defense equipment being developed by the Israeli defense sector. This was mainly done to plug the gaps in India's arsenal. Thus, Israel's expertise in the defense and security sphere helped bridge the covert bilateral ties from 1960 onwards until 1992. On the other hand, Israel saw India as a linchpin in furthering its geopolitical strategy to contain regional powers. Regional powers like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Pakistan were the primary targets for Israel, and to counter their roles in destabilizing the region, especially with regard to sponsoring terrorism and their pursuit of nuclear weapons. So Israel considered these developments to be a threat to the existence of the state of Israel. Terrorism, which was being sponsored by countries like Iran, wherein Iran was sponsoring groups like Hamas and the Hezbollah. On the other hand, we had Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, which were primarily behind the creation of the Afghan Mujahideen and the Taliban. So Israel perceived the creation of these groups and the support that these groups were receiving as a major threat to its own sovereignty and its integrity, as well as the pursuit of developing nuclear weapons by these countries in the region posed a threat to Israel. So Israel believed that by working with the Indian government and the Indian agencies, it will be able to counter the destabilizing role being played by some of the regional countries. So these factors enabled the countries to develop a very close working relationship, especially between their security and defense agencies. And this was the nature of ties between 1960 to 1992, where a covert relationship was established. In the public domain, there was no full-fledged diplomatic contact. This was primarily because of the external and internal constraints that was being imposed on the Indian government. Thus, pragmatism and realpolitik had replaced the much cherished idealistic values which were preventing a closer embrace between the two countries. In fact, this covert cooperation yielded many positive outcomes. Let's have a look at some of the positive outcomes of this covert relationship during that period. Gary J. Bass, who is a journalist, writes in his book, The Blood Telegram, which primarily deals with the Indian role in the liberation of Bangladesh War of 1971. He goes on to reveal that Israel had supplied critical arms and weapons to the Indian forces when India was facing a dire shortage of critical equipment. His claims are based on declassified documents available with both the American government and as well as with the Indian government. So the observation made by Gary J. Bass in his book The Blood Telegram clearly shows the covert relationship that existed between India and Israel way back in 1971. The second instance where both countries kept a close watch on the Pakistani nuclear program and also the nexus between China, Pakistan, Iran, Libya and North Korea in proliferating nuclear technology. Both India and Israel were working together to monitor the nuclear program of these countries, wherein China was playing a critical role in proliferating nuclear technology into the hands of the Pakistani establishment, and this was further being proliferated into other countries like Iran, North Korea and Libya. So this was the second instance where India and Israel were working together in the 70s and in the 80s. Also, both countries worked together to counter terror groups in Kashmir and as well as in the region beyond. Because during the phase which saw the birth of militancy in Kashmir post 1987, Israeli tourists were being targeted by some of the Kashmir militant groups. This was largely done with the backing of the state agencies of Pakistan. So when India and Israel realized the existing nexus between the state and the non-state actors, both started working together to counter some of these militant outfits in Kashmir. While the covert relationship was flourishing, India did not publicly acknowledge these ties, much to the discomfort of Israel, because Israel was trying to woo India to establish full-scale diplomatic contacts. This changed only in the year 1992. The nature of ties between India and Israel underwent a paradigm shift in 1992. And the primary reason was the breakup of the Soviet Union. So once the Cold War ended, once the Soviet Union disintegrated, the geopolitical realities had completely undergone a transformation. India had just lost a reliable partner. It was on the lookout for new friends in order to diversify its diplomatic investments. The time was just right for India to engage with Israel publicly for the first time. Until 1992, Israel did not have an embassy in India. There was just a small immigration office which was working out of Mumbai. So the situation in 1992 was just ideal for both countries to establish full-fledged diplomatic ties. Under the Narasimha Rao government in 1992, India finally established the full-fledged diplomatic relations with Israel. Since then, India's ties with Israel has diversified into multiple sectors. Because prior to 1992, our relationship was primarily based on defense and security ties. But post 1992, it is no longer limited to defense and the security sphere, and it has diversified into multiple sectors, especially sectors like agriculture, water management, desalination, cooperation in space technology, cybersecurity, trade, and as well as culture. These are some of the important domains where India and Israel have developed a very close relationship post 1992. Let's briefly talk about some of the important arrangements that we have with Israel in the respective sectors. If we talk about agriculture, we see that geographically Israel is literally located in a desert where there is scarcity of water, the conditions are very harsh. So Israel has managed to overcome these hurdles by developing scientific methods and scientific techniques with regard to farming and as well as harvesting. So Israeli expertise is being used by India and some of the state governments in India to bring the best practices in the field of agriculture to the Indian environment. There are agreements between the government of Karnataka, the government of Rajasthan with the Israeli government where olives are being cultivated in farms. Next, Israel is also a pioneer in the development of drought-resistant crops. It has developed scientific farming techniques and there are a variety of implements which have made Israel one of the leading agricultural industries in the world. So India believes that it stands to gain by working with Israel in the field of agriculture, primarily to capitalize on the drought-resistant crops and the scientific farming techniques which Israel has developed. And with regard to water management and desalination, again, Israel is a global leader. It has set up modern desalination plants which capitalizes on the saline water which is easily available from the Mediterranean Sea and converts it into potable water. So Israel's expertise in desalination and as well as in water management holds a lot of importance for India because India is also facing huge problems with regard to water management. It's facing challenges with regard to addressing the water scarcity issues in the arid and semi-arid regions within India. So India believes its cooperation with Israel, its diplomatic arrangement with Israel will help bring the best practices in the field of water management and as well as in desalination. Next, if we talk about space technology, ISRO and its counterpart in Israel have a very close working relationship. In fact, in the last few years, two satellites known as TechSAR and RISAT have been launched by ISRO. The satellites were primarily developed with Israeli assistance. Both these satellites carry the synthetic aperture radar as a payload, which has a defense application, especially in surveillance and in mapping. And both the space agencies are working on future projects as well, which will bring in convergence in the strategic interests of both the countries. Next, talking about cybersecurity. Israel is a country which is considered as a pioneer in the field of cyber warfare. Its offensive and as well as its defensive capabilities is revered across the world. Its Talpiot program is an elite program which trains cyber warriors. It has churned out cyber graduates who carry out offensive and defensive operations as far as Israel's cyber command is concerned. It has a clearly established cyber command structure, and the workforce for the cyber command structure is coming in from the Talpiot program. In fact, the Stuxnet virus, which was believed to be of Israeli origin, which crippled the Iranian nuclear program, is attributed to the Talpiot program. So India, which has recently come out with a National Cybersecurity Act and which plans to increase the human resource available in the field of cyber security, it can work with the Israeli armed forces, the Israeli defense forces, and it can learn from the Talpiot program to bring the best practices in the field of cyber warfare and cyber security into the Indian domain. Even with regard to trade, trade is flourishing between both the countries since 1992. Primarily, diamonds is one of the critical exports from India. Diamond polishing is a very important industry of cooperation between India and Israel. Then we also have information technology and pharmaceuticals, which has led to a flourishing trade relationship between India and Israel. And if we talk about culture, especially people-to-people contacts, there are many instances to show that both the countries have a very close cultural bond. In fact, Indian origin Jewish immigrants can be found in Israel in quite large numbers. The Indian Prime Minister, during his visit, interacted with these immigrants. He interacted with the Indian community. On the other hand, we have Jewish population which is settled in many regions in India. The Malabar Jews who reside in the Malabar coast are believed to have migrated from Israel to India in the ancient days, during the King Solomon days. We also find Jews who have migrated from Israel in Maharashtra and in Goa as well. And more recently, in northeastern part of India, there are many tribes who are adopting Judaism as a religion. So this clearly shows the increasing bond between the societies of both the countries. Because in diplomacy, people-to-people contacts is a very important area which will bring the two governments closer as well. When people-to-people contacts are flourishing, it acts as an influence on both the governments to maintain good contacts. Talking further about cultural ties between India and Israel, we can see that yoga and Indian movies especially are extremely popular in Israel. So this is an avenue where India is projecting its soft power in the region. India is capitalizing on its soft power potential to develop good relations with the state of Israel. So we can say that post 1992, India and Israel have diversified their contacts into multiple sectors. It's no longer reliant primarily on defense and security ties. Many other sectors like agriculture, water management, culture, trade, and even space and cybersecurity cooperation have come to occupy the center stage. Defense and security ties still continues to be the fulcrum of the relationship. Post 1992, Israel has assisted India in rapidly reinforcing its security posture. It was one of the very few countries which did not condemn the Pokhran II nuclear explosions. And it understood India's strategic need to develop nuclear weapons. Also, during the Kargil conflict, Israel provided India with laser-guided bomb kits, which were mated with the Indian Air Force fighter aircrafts, and this played a crucial role in destroying enemy defenses during the Kargil conflict. Also during Operation Parakram, which India initiated as a response to the parliament attacks, Israel provided critical arms and weapons to reinforce India's gaps in its defense infrastructure. And more recently, terror attacks like 26/11, which targeted Israeli interests in India, have further brought the two countries closer in developing a very close intelligence sharing and cooperation arrangement. Indian security forces regularly undergo training in Israel, and this helps in capacity building of the Indian forces. Since Israel too faces multiple challenges, especially with regard to border conflicts and insurgency, both the countries stand to gain by working together. In fact, RAW and IB, which are the external and internal intelligence agencies of India, have developed very close working relationship with their respective counterparts, that is Mossad and the Shin Bet. And this arrangement has brought the security ties between two countries extremely close. The respective agencies are working together to jointly combat terrorism, which is backed by state actors in the region. India has become the largest importer of Israeli defense systems as well. Israel is currently India's third largest provider of defense equipment after Russia and the United States. Now let's look at some of the defense equipments and platforms that India has acquired from Israel. We have the Barak surface-to-air missile system. It's primarily an air defense system which India has already inducted into its armed forces. Then DRDO and the Israeli aerospace industries are jointly working on long-range and medium-range surface-to-air missiles. Because the Barak surface-to-air missile has a very short range of around 70 kilometers. So currently, both the departments or both the agencies are working on developing a long range and a medium range surface to air missile for both the defense forces. Next, we have Falcon AWACS, which is an airborne early warning system which has been inducted into the Indian Air Force. Then Israel is also a leader in the field of developing unmanned aerial vehicles or UAVs. So India has clearly set its eyes on the drones that are being developed in Israel. We have already inducted the Heron and the Searcher into our armed forces. The Army, the Air Force, and as well as the Indian Navy has already inducted the Heron and the Searcher drones. Currently, we are focusing on Heron TP, which is the armed version of the previous UAV. So India has clearly set its sight on importing the Heron TP drones, which are an armed version of the unmanned aerial vehicles developed by Israel. An armed unmanned aerial vehicle provides a unique tactical and strategic edge to the armed forces. If the Indian forces are equipped with the Heron TP drones, we will have an advantage in case of carrying out surgical strikes. It will minimize the human cost that would be involved in carrying out a cross-border raid. It will also help in keeping the conflict localized without further escalating the situation. So in case of any terror attack which is traced back to a neighboring country, India will have a low cost, a low risk option of deploying these unmanned aerial vehicles which can launch attacks on targeted sites. Next, we have the Spike missiles, which is essentially an anti-tank missile system which India is importing from Israel. So put together, these are the different defense platforms which India has imported from Israel. Despite the broad spectrum of ties between India and Israel, which has been flourishing since 1992, the full potential of these ties could not be realized due to India's constraints. The external and the internal constraints that we discussed, it had an hangover even post 1992. In fact, successive governments have been mindful of three factors. One, with regard to domestic electoral considerations. Second, with regard to India's principled approach over the plight of the Palestinian population. And third, India did not want to antagonize the Arab powers like Iran and Saudi Arabia. So these external and internal constraints had a hangover even post 1992, even after we had established full-fledged diplomatic contacts with Israel. So this has curtailed India in engaging with Israel at the highest levels. This was the reason why an Indian Prime Minister could not visit Israel in the last 70 years. Even after the establishment of full-fledged diplomatic ties, the conditions were not feasible for an Indian Prime Minister to visit Israel. As a result, India has consistently equated Israel and Palestine. This can be brought out by the fact that any visit to Israel by a prominent Indian leader post 1992, including the recent presidential visit in 2015, it was accompanied by a follow-up visit to Palestine. So whenever an Indian leader visits Israel, it was almost an established convention that he would also have a follow-up visit immediately to Palestine, just to assure the Palestinian population and the Palestinian political outfits. Also, India has consistently voted against Israel at many international organizations, including the UNHRC and the UNESCO. Israel is regularly brought up at the UN Human Rights Commission for violation of human rights. India has consistently voted against the government of Israel. With regard to UNESCO, when Palestine was supposed to be included as a member, India voted for the resolution which angered the Israeli government. While India is right in condemning the use of excessive force by Israeli defense forces, especially against civilians in Gaza and in West Bank, also India condemns the illegal construction of Jewish settlements in Palestine, which is violative of established conventions. And also India has supported a two-state solution. India has begun accepting a two-state solution because this seems to be the only viable option if we have to resolve the conflict in Middle East. So even though India is right in condemning the actions of the Israeli defense forces, especially in Gaza and West Bank, India is right in condemning the illegal construction of Jewish settlements, and India is right in supporting a two-state solution. But this stand of India cannot hamper the pragmatic pursuit of diplomatic ties, that too with an important partner like Israel. At the end of the day, while we are upholding idealism and principled values with regard to human rights, anti-imperialism, etc., we also need to protect and promote our national interests. We cannot treat this as a zero-sum game, and both should go hand in hand. Our relationship with Israel, our relationship with Palestinian groups and the Arab countries have to go hand in hand. We need to find a mid path where we are able to balance the relationship on both the sides. So protecting and promoting our national interests should take priority over idealistic and principled values, especially in our relationship with Israel and Palestine. This is the exact reason why the recent visit by Prime Minister Modi is a historic step in our bilateral ties. For the first time, India has managed to dehyphenate its stand on Israel and Palestine. For the first time, we have dehyphenated Israel from Palestine. We are no longer treating Israel on the same level as that of Palestine. This was evident when the Prime Minister consciously excluded a visit to Palestine, which more or less was an established convention. But it's interesting to note that the PM also emphasized on a two-state solution. So this has been done despite a significant shift in India's policy since 2014 under the new government. Since 2014, India has actually toned down its criticism of Israeli policies, especially with regard to the allegations of violation of human rights by Israel, the use of excessive force by Israel, and the construction of illegal Jewish settlements. India has actually toned down its criticism with regard to these policies of Israel. Also, India has abstained from voting against Israel in international resolutions. India has started abstaining from the voting process at UNHRC and other international organizations which are primarily targeting Israel. So while the Indian government under Prime Minister Modi has clearly portrayed or clearly displayed a shift in its strategy with regard to Israel, it is still adopting a traditional approach wherein we are supporting the two-state solution. India has not abandoned Palestine. India has not abandoned its principled approach with regard to the rights of the Palestinians. It's just that there has been a pragmatic shift under the new regime, which is clearly evident in the recent visit of the Prime Minister. At the same time, the Modi government has taken care to address sensitivities in the Middle Eastern region as well, especially prior to the visit to Israel. Prior to the visit of the Indian Prime Minister to Israel, India took care to revamp its ties with Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Iran. This was primarily done to address the sensitivities in the Middle Eastern region. So since 2014, the Modi government has adopted a well-calibrated shift in its Israel policy. The traditional Indian approach has been abandoned and a more pragmatic approach has been adopted. So in order to ensure this transition, the new government has taken enough measures to address the concerns of Middle Eastern countries, especially Saudi Arabia, Iran, and UAE, by revamping our ties with these countries. And even the Palestinian government has been given enough attention. We have recently hosted the Palestinian president. So this balancing act being played out by India with regard to its Israel and Palestinian policy clearly showcases a pragmatic approach in dealing with such a complicated region. But there are a few pitfalls for India as well. India needs to watch out with regard to certain developments, especially the recent statements by the supreme leader of Iran. Ayatollah Khamenei has commented on Kashmir and equated Kashmir with other conflict-ridden regions like Yemen and Syria. Also, the Organization of Islamic Conference, which is a grouping of Islamic countries across the world, regularly the Kashmir dispute is highlighted at the OIC conference. So the recent statements by the Supreme Leader of Iran on Kashmir and as well as the focus on Kashmir dispute at the OIC has followed India's shift in its Israel-Palestinian policy. And this is no coincidence. And India needs to watch out to ensure it does not lose out on the hard-won diplomatic gains in the region. India needs to take enough care to address the sensitivities of the Iranian government. Also, care should be taken to ensure that India and Israel relationship should never fall into the trap of being fueled by jingoistic elements, religious fundamentalists, and majoritarian elements who exist on both sides. In conclusion, India's traditional approach in dealing with Israel has clearly passed its expiry date, where India was hesitant in acknowledging its full-fledged ties with Israel publicly. Now we have actually done well to move away from this outdated approach. Going forward, India should learn to balance its ties with Israel and the Gulf countries while we are upholding the Palestinian cause. So India needs to fine-tune this approach wherein we are able to balance our considerations, our concerns with Israel, with the Gulf countries, and as well as with the Palestinian cause. So India needs to fine-tune this approach of playing the balancing role in the Middle Eastern region. So this concludes the lecture with regard to India and Israel's relationship. Thanks for listening.